"Thank you very much," said the bartender, lowering himself onto the stool, the back leg of which then caved in with a crash. The bartender let out a groan and hit his rump painfully against the floor. As he fell, his leg upset another stool nearby, spilling a full glass of red wine all over his trousers. The artiste exclaimed, "Oops, did you hurt yourself?" Azazello helped the bartender get up and offered him another seat. In a grief-stricken voice, the bartender refused his host's suggestion that he remove his trousers and dry them in front of the fire. Feeling extremely uncomfortable in his wet underwear and clothes, he sat down gingerly on the other stool. "I love sitting low to the ground," said the artiste, "because then falling off isn't so dangerous. Now then, we were talking about the sturgeon, were we not? My dear fellow, freshness, freshness, and more freshness. That should be every buffet manager's motto." "Yes, well, wouldn't you like to have a taste?" Here, in the crimson glow of the fireplace, a sword flashed in front of the bartender, and Azazello put a sizzling piece of meat on a golden platter. He sprinkled it with lemon juice and handed the bartender a two-pronged gold fork. "Thank you very much, but No, try it." Out of politeness, the bartender put a piece in his mouth and realized immediately that he was eating something that was truly very fresh and, what's more, unusually tasty. But even so, as the bartender chewed the fragrant, succulent meat, he almost choked and fell a second time. A large, dark bird flew in from the adjoining room, softly brushing its wing against the bartender's bald head. Alighting on the mantelpiece next to the clock, it turned out to be an owl. "Oh my God," thought Andrei Fokich, who, like all bartenders, was nervous and edgy. "This is some apartment. A glass of wine? White? Red? Which imported wine do you prefer at this hour?" "Thank you, but I don't drink." "How unfortunate. How about a game of dice? Or do you like some other games? Dominoes? Cards?" "I don't play," replied the already weary bartender. "Well, that's the limit," concluded the host. "There is, if you don't mind my saying so, something sinister about men who avoid wine, games, the company of charming women, and good dinner-table conversation. People like that are either seriously ill, or they secretly disdain their fellow men. True, there are exceptions. Among those who have feasted with me, there have sometimes been extraordinary cads. And so tell me, what brings you here?" "Yesterday you had occasion to perform some tricks." "I?" the magician exclaimed in amazement. "I beg your pardon, that isn't my sort of thing." "Sorry," said the bartender, taken aback, "but what about the performance of black magic?" "Oh, that? Well, of course, my dear man. I'll tell you a secret. I'm not a stage performer at all. I just wanted to see the citizens of Moscow en masse. And the easiest way to do it was in a theater. So my retinue here," he nodded at the cat, "arranged the performance while I merely sat and watched the Muscovites. But don't look like that. Just tell me what it was about the performance that brought you here." "If you recall, among other things, paper money flew down from the ceiling." The bartender lowered his voice and looked around in embarrassment. "Well, everybody started grabbing the bills, and a young man comes up to me at the bar and gives me a 10-ruble bill, and I give him 8.50 in change. Then someone else, also a young man? No, an older man. Then a third came, a fourth. I give them all change. And today, when I went to check the cash register, I looked, and what do I see but strips of paper instead of money? The bar was 109 rubles short." "Dear, oh dear," exclaimed the artiste. "Can they truly have thought it was real money?" "I can't believe they did it on purpose." The bartender looked around wryly and miserably, but said nothing. "Can they really have been swindlers?" the magician asked his guest anxiously. "Can there really be swindlers in Moscow?" The bartender smiled so bitterly in reply that no doubts remained. There were indeed swindlers in Moscow. "That's beneath contempt," said Voland in outrage. "You're a poor man. You are a poor man, aren't you?" The bartender drew his head into his shoulders so that it would become obvious that he was a poor man. "How much do you have in savings?" Although the question was asked sympathetically, it was impossible not to view a question like that as indelicate. The bartender squirmed. 249,000 rubles in 5 separate savings accounts, came a cracked voice from the next room. and 210-ruble gold pieces under the floor at home. The bartender seemed to be riveted to his stool. Well, that isn't so large a sum, of course, said Voland indulgently to his guest. Although, strictly speaking, it is of no use to you. When will you die? Here the bartender became indignant. Nobody knows that, and it's nobody's business, he replied. True, nobody knows, came the same noxious voice from the study, but it's hardly Newton's binomial theorem. He'll die in 9 months, that is next February, from cancer of the liver, in the first Moscow State University Clinic. Ward number 4. The bartender's face turned yellow. 9 months, Voland calculated thoughtfully. 249,000. In round numbers, that comes out to 27,000 a month. Isn't that right? Not a lot, but enough if one lives modestly. And there's still the gold rubles. You won't manage to cash those in, broke in the same voice, sending a chill through the bartender's heart. After Andrei Fokich dies, they'll tear down the house right away and the gold rubles will be sent to the state bank. And I wouldn't advise you to go to the clinic either, the artiste continued. What point is there in dying in a ward, listening to the moans and rasps of the terminally ill? Wouldn't it be better to spend the 27,000 on a banquet than, after taking poison, depart for the other world to the sound of violins, surrounded by intoxicated, beautiful women and dashing friends? The bartender sat motionless and seemed to have gotten much older. His eyes had dark circles around them. His cheeks drooped, and his lower jaw sagged. But we've gotten off track, exclaimed the host. Back to business. Show me your strips of paper. Shaken, the bartender pulled a package out of his pocket, untied it, and froze. Wrapped in the newspaper were 10-ruble bills. My dear fellow, you really are ill, said Voland, shrugging his shoulders. The bartender got up from the stool, a strange smile on his face. But, he said, stuttering, but what if they try to... again? The artiste grew pensive. Well, then, come back and see us again, by all means. Happy to have made your acquaintance. Here Koroviev popped out of the study, grabbed the bartender's hand, and started shaking it, begging Andrei Fokich to give everyone his regards. Completely befuddled, the bartender headed for the entrance hall. Hella, show him out, shouted Koroviev. Again, the naked redhead appeared in the hall. The bartender squeezed through the door, squeaked out a goodbye, and staggered on his way like a drunk. After going down a few steps, he stopped and sat down on the stairs. He pulled out the package to check the contents. The 10-ruble bills were still there. At that point, a woman with a green bag came out of the apartment facing the landing. Seeing a man sitting on the step, staring dully at 10-ruble bills, she smiled and said pensively, What a building we have. Only morning and this guy's already drunk. The window on the stairs is smashed again. She studied the bartender more carefully and added, Hey, citizen, you're up to your ears in 10-ruble bills. How about throwing some my way, huh? Leave me alone, for Christ's sake, said the bartender fearfully and quickly hid the money. The woman laughed. Go to hell, you old skinflint. I was just joking. And she started down the stairs. The bartender got up slowly, raised his hand to adjust his hat, and found that it wasn't on his head. The thought of going back was horrible, but he regretted the loss of his hat. He hesitated for a moment, but then went back and rang the bell. What do you want now? Asked the hellish Hella. I forgot my hat, whispered the bartender, poking at his bald head. Hella turned away. The bartender mentally spat and closed his eyes. When he opened them, Hella was handing him his hat and a sword with a dark hilt. That's not mine, whispered the bartender, pushing the sword aside and quickly putting on his hat. Did you really come without a sword? Marveled Hella. The bartender mumbled something and started swiftly down the stairs. For some reason, his head felt hot and uncomfortable in the hat. He took it off and, jumping with fright, let out a soft yelp. In his hands was a velvet beret with a rumpled cock's feather. The bartender crossed himself. At that very moment, the beret meowed and turned into a black kitten, which then leapt back onto Andrei Fokich's head and dug its claws into his bald spot. Letting out a desperate scream, the bartender plunged down the stairs, and the kitten fell off his head and scooted back up the stairs. Bursting out into the open air, the bartender ran over to the gates at a trot and left Devil's Den number 302B forever. What happened to him next is well known. After bursting through the gateway, the bartender looked around wildly, as if searching for something. A minute later, he was in a drugstore across the street. Just as he uttered the words, "Tell me, please," the woman behind the counter yelled out, "Citizen, your head is all cut up." 5 minutes later, the bartender, wearing a gauze bandage, found out that the leading specialists in liver disease were considered to be Professors Bernadsky and Kuzmin. When he asked which one was closer, he lit up with joy when he learned that Kuzmin lived literally across the yard in a little white house. 2 minutes later, he was there. The house was old but very comfortable, very cozy. Thinking about it later, the bartender recalled that the first person to greet him was an elderly nurse who wanted to take his hat, but since he did not have one, she shuffled off somewhere, chewing on her toothless gums. Next came a middle-aged woman who materialized next to a mirror and under what appeared to be an archway. She told him that the earliest appointment she could give him was the 19th, no sooner. The bartender realized immediately how he could get around that. After glancing with a fading eye through the archway, where 3 men were sitting in what was manifestly a waiting room, he whispered, "I'm terminally ill." The woman looked perplexedly at his bandaged head, hesitated, and said, "Well then," and let the bartender pass through the arch. At that moment, the door across the way opened, a gold pince-nez sparkled, and a woman in a white coat said, "Citizens, this patient has priority." Before he could turn his head, the bartender found himself in Dr. Kuzmin's office. The room was rather long, and there was nothing frightening, medical, or solemn about it. "What seems to be the problem?" inquired Dr. Kuzmin in a pleasant voice, looking a bit apprehensively at the bandaged head. "I've just learned from a reliable source," the bartender replied, staring wildly at a framed group photograph, "that I'm going to die of cancer of the liver next February. Please stop that from happening." Professor Kuzmin arched himself against the high back of the Gothic leather chair. "Excuse me, but I don't understand. You mean you've been to a doctor? Why is your head bandaged?" "What doctor? You should have seen this doctor," replied the bartender, and suddenly his teeth began to chatter. "Don't bother about my head. It has nothing to do with this. The hell with my head. It's beside the point. It's the liver cancer I want you to stop." "But who was it who told you?" "You better believe him," the bartender implored him passionately. "Because he knows." "I don't understand any of this," said the doctor, shrugging his shoulders and moving his chair back from the desk. "How can he know when you're going to die, especially when he's not even a doctor?" "In ward number 4, the bartender replied. The doctor then stared at his patient, at his head, at his damp trousers, and thought, "That's all I need, a madman." He asked, "Do you drink vodka?" "Never touch the stuff," the bartender replied. A minute later, he was undressed, lying on a cold oilskin couch, and the doctor was kneading his stomach. Here, it must be said, the bartender cheered up considerably. The doctor stated categorically that the bartender showed absolutely no signs, at least at the present time, of liver cancer, but that since he was afraid and some charlatan had scared him to death, he should have all the necessary tests. The doctor wrote out instructions for him, explaining where he was to go and what he was to bring. In addition, he gave him a referral slip for a neuropathologist, Dr. Burr, saying that his nerves were completely shot. "How much do I owe you, doctor?" the bartender asked in a soft, trembling voice as he pulled out a thick wallet. "Whatever you wish," the doctor replied dryly and brusquely. The bartender took out 30 rubles and put them on the desk, and then, with unexpected softness, as if with a cat's paw, he placed a jingling stack of gold coins wrapped in newspaper on top of them. "And what is that?" asked Kuzmin, twirling his mustache. "Don't turn your nose up at it, doctor," the bartender whispered. "I beg you, stop the cancer." "Take back your gold," said the professor, feeling proud of himself. "You'd do better to look after your nerves. Bring in a urine sample tomorrow. Don't drink a lot of tea, and don't use any salt on your food." "Not even in my soup?" asked the bartender. "Don't put salt on anything," ordered Kuzmin. "Oh," the bartender exclaimed dejectedly, looking entreatingly at the doctor as he gathered up his coins and backed away toward the door. The doctor had only a few patients that evening, and by dusk the last one had left. As he was taking off his robe, he glanced at the place where the bartender had left the 3 10-ruble notes, and instead of rubles, he saw 3 Abro d'Urso champagne labels. "Well, I'll be damned," muttered Kuzmin, trailing his robe over the floor and fingering the pieces of paper. Not only was he a schizophrenic, he was a swindler too. but I still can't understand what he wanted from me. All that for a urine analysis? Oh, I bet he stole my coat. And the doctor rushed into the entrance hall, dragging his robe by one sleeve. Ksenia Nikitchina, he shouted shrilly in the doorway. Check and see, are the coats still there? As it turned out, they all were, but when the doctor returned to his office and finally took off his robe, he stood rooted to the parquet floor, his eyes trained on his desk. There where the labels had been sat a stray black kitten, looking very forlorn and meowing over a saucer of milk. What is this, pray tell? This is really too... Kuzmin felt a chill at the back of his neck. Ksenia Nikitchina rushed in when she heard the doctor's whimpering cry and calmed him down completely by telling him that one of the patients had obviously left the kitten there and that such things often happen to doctors. They're probably poor, explained Ksenia Nikitchina, whereas we, of course... They tried to figure out who had left the kitten surreptitiously. Suspicion fell on an old woman with stomach ulcers. Of course, she's the one, said Ksenia Nikitchina. She probably thought, I don't care if I live or die, but I feel sorry for the poor kitten. But really, cried Kuzmin. And what about the milk? Did she bring that too? And the saucer as well? She brought it in a bottle and poured it into a saucer here, volunteered Ksenia Nikitchina. No matter, take the kitten and the saucer away, said Kuzmin, escorting Ksenia Nikitchina to the door. When he went back, the situation had changed. As he was hanging up his robe, the doctor heard laughter in the courtyard. He looked out and was naturally struck dumb. A woman wearing only a chemise was running across the yard to the building opposite. The doctor even knew who it was. Maria Alexandrovna. A boy was giggling. What's going on? Said Kuzmin contemptuously. Just then, on the other side of the wall in his daughter's room, the foxtrot Hallelujah started playing on the phonograph. And at the same moment, a sparrow started chirping behind Kuzmin's back. He turned around and saw a huge sparrow hopping on top of his desk. Just keep calm, the doctor said to himself. Must have flown in when I had my back to the window. Everything's okay, the doctor told himself, feeling in his heart that everything was not okay, and mainly, of course, because of the sparrow. When he looked at it more closely, the doctor realized immediately that it was not exactly an ordinary sparrow. The filthy bird was lame in its left foot and was behaving in an obviously affected way, dragging the foot in syncopated rhythm. In a word, the sparrow was doing a foxtrot to the music playing on the phonograph, like a drunk at a bar. The bird acted as rudely as it knew how, staring insolently at the doctor. Kuzmin reached for the phone, thinking that he would call his old classmate and colleague Burr to ask him what it meant when you started seeing sparrows like that at age 60, and when your head was spinning to boot. Meanwhile, the sparrow landed on the inkstand, which had been given to the doctor as a gift, befouled it, I'm not kidding, flew up in the air, hovered briefly, and then with a steely beak pecked furiously at the glass on the graduation photo of the class of 1894, shattering it to bits. After that, it flew out the window. Instead of calling Burr, the professor decided to call the Bureau of Leeches, saying that he, Dr. Kuzmin, wanted them to send him over some leeches right away. After putting down the receiver, the doctor turned back to his desk and immediately let out a wail. Sitting at his desk, wearing a nurse's kerchief, was a woman with a bag that said leeches. The doctor screamed when he saw her mouth. It was a man's mouth, crooked, open to the ears, with one fang sticking out. The nurse's eyes were dead. I'll take the money, said the nurse in a man's bass voice. No point in it lying around here. She raked up the champagne labels with a bird's claw and melted into thin air. 2 hours went by. Dr. Kuzmin was sitting in bed in his room with leeches stuck to his temples, his neck, and behind his ears. On the silk quilt at his feet sat the gray-whiskered Dr. Burr, looking at him with sympathy and trying to reassure him that it was all nonsense. Outside the window it was already night. We have no idea whether there were any other strange occurrences in Moscow that night, and we have no intention of trying to find out, since the time has come for us to proceed to part 2 of this true narrative. Follow me, reader.